Honorable Kuku, thank you so much for making time to speak with us at such short notice. We are grateful. What happened on Friday? Was it expected?
No, I was not expecting it. I don't think the majority side expected this. And it is because the budget, as it came, is a document that contains many resource mobilization requests and also resource allocation requests. So you accept the budget as some kind of working document so that Parliament has the opportunity to look at the various requests within the budget and approve or reject them one after the other. That is what we used to. So the idea of rejecting the budget as a whole was something that we did not expect. In fact, last year, an attempt was made to vote it down, but they didn't have the numbers at the time. And I assume that because they didn't have the numbers, they probably wanted to just send a message. Nobody thought, before we went to the chamber last week, that the majority would indeed want to vote down the budget and deny Parliament the opportunity to look at the individual request for revenue measures and the individual resource allocation request in the budget. So it came as a surprise.
What will be the economic implications of such an action, rejection of the budget?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the budget is still before Parliament. And I say that because once the budget was presented to us, it needed Parliament to make a decision whether to accept the budget or not. The 137 present in the chamber could not have made the decision constitutionally, even if they attempted to. I don't think it was a valid decision made, nor the majority side believe that it was a valid decision made. Okay. Therefore, as far as we are concerned, it is still before the House. The good thing is that we are in 2021, so expenditures and revenue revenue mobilization activities are being governed by the 2021 budget statement, which has been approved. So immediately, it has no effect on current expenditure of government. Now, what we need to perhaps be considering is if Parliament is unable to approve the budget that is, as far as I'm concerned, is already before us, then what happens when the year begins? Because the appropriation we had was up to the close of 2021. Mm-hmm. Now, the Constitution says whenever the President believes that we would not get an appropriation act in place before the beginning of a period that requires expenditure, then the government is allowed to bring what we call expenditure in advance of appropriation. Mm-hmm. Now, what that means is that it would be for a shorter period, maybe 3 months, maybe a month, and then government says, give me an approval so that I can mobilize this amount of money and spend this amount of money over a shorter period, whilst we take our time to go through the proper processes to get an appropriation act in place.
But what measures should we be putting in place between now and January so that at least we have funds allocated for Q1?
Some people have already suggested that given the tightness of the time, the finance minister, for instance, should contemplate bringing expenditure in advance of appropriation to Parliament. Now, what people forget is that the expenditure in advance of appropriation will also come with revenue mobilization. So if government considers that be the e-transaction levy or any other measure, even within 4 weeks, will be required to raise the revenue to meet the expenditures that we are approving in advance of appropriation, it means even that could come with some revenue measures. Right. Now, in the past, where we have had expenditure in advance of appropriation, we have indeed had some revenue measures in them. Now, if the current disagreements between the majority and minority side are around some of those measures, it means even a request for approval for expenditure in advance of appropriation could also face the same issues that the current budget is facing. In that event, the option that would be left to us as a country would be for the president to declare a state of emergency from the beginning of January, and at least give himself the authority to pay workers, government workers, to meet our international obligations and do all the things that we would need money to do, whilst the majority and the minority
battle it out in Parliament.
Yes, to see when we get a budget. And I think government should begin to contemplate that, the possibility of declaring a state of emergency. So in the absence of a budget, or in the absence of a vote on account or expenditure, a request for a request and approval of an expenditure in advance of appropriation, the president may have to really contemplate declaring a state of emergency from the beginning of next year. But we hope it won't have to come to that. I mean, the majority side still is the majority side. It turned out that that day we were not in the chamber. I am sure that if the majority side organizes itself, it is possible to pass the budget and then to get the individual request under the budget reconsidered by Parliament. So it probably will not have to come to that. But given the way things are playing out, I think the Ministry of Finance and government ought to start contemplating the possibility of a state of emergency under which the president would have the authority to spend to meet critical expenditures such as payment of the salaries of government workers.
Would that mean government shutting down? I mean, if a state of emergency?
No. When you declare a state of emergency, all you're saying is that the normal constitutional processes that would have approved some expenditures no more apply because of the situation. And so the president then would be able to spend normally. People in the street will not notice anything.
Right.
Government will just spend. Of course, the president in that event will still be required by the Constitution to exercise his discretion reasonably.
But where would that money be coming from? I mean, he will still need money to be able to pay salaries, like you say, and do all those.
But a state of emergency would also mean that the president has the power to mobilize resources if that is needed to keep the country. So under a state of emergency, revenue will still be collected at the ports. In fact, technically, if there are revenue measures that are needed, the president may well say, in the circumstances, I need to mobilize that revenue or that revenue and meet the critical expenditures of state. And so it's not just an expenditure discussion, it's always an expenditure and revenue discussion. So that is where we are now. But as I indicated, I consider that it may not come to that. I consider that the two sides may be able to come to some understanding of an acceptable way, mutually acceptable way going forward, or in the absence of that, the majority is the majority. It should be possible for the majority to insist on the decision they find appropriate, and therefore sooner than later, I am sure these matters will be resolved.
Let's look at the key issues raised by the minority, reason why they're rejecting the budget, and a few other issues that stakeholders have raised. Top will be the electronic transaction levy. Do you think that the finance ministry should be looking at reviewing some of the issues and concerns raised?
Sure, government should always listen to different perspectives in respect of the things it does to govern the country. But I have heard a lot about we don't want this tax. What I haven't heard enough of is what then do you want? Maybe taxation on e-transaction is not the way to go now. You think it should be put on fuel? Or if you think it should not be put on anything and that there just ought not to be any taxes, then you need to also indicate, given the budget that was presented, what expenditures we must forgo. Until those who have issues with the budget come up with those clear alternatives, I find it hard to accommodate the suggestions they're making, because if the revenue measures were not to be activated and yet we proceed with the expenditures, the consequences for the city would be such that the very poor you're trying to protect would end up paying a very high price. And I say the poor because when the city drops and the cost of living rises, it is the vulnerable that get most hard hit.
But we're already experiencing that.
So if you're already experiencing that, then you don't want to make it worse. You don't want to make it worse. I have already indicated that if I look at the 2022 budget as was presented to us, the fiscal is already tight. The fiscal, even with all the e-transaction levy and all the revenue measures in there, the fiscal is tight. And there's a good reason why it is tight. 2020 came with unexpected consequences. Not only did revenue not perform, the pandemic itself came with unanticipated expenditures.
Right.
Now, government then came to Parliament and said that, look, in the midst of all this, I'm unable to comply with the requirements in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that says you should not be able to spend more than 5% deficit. That is to say, money that we do not have, don't spend more than 5%. Exactly. On cash basis. But the law provided that if there are reasons why you cannot comply with that for any particular year, come back to Parliament and get approval to suspend that rule. In 2020, government actually came to Parliament and got that rule suspended. So in 2020, we did some 11.7 deficit. Now, if you want your city to stabilize, it means in the medium term, you would have to get back to normal ways. So if you look at the budget that was presented, government has presented what you call a medium-term fiscal deficit path. That is to say, we will close the gap next year to from 11, we will come to say 7, we will go to 5, and then by the close of 2024, I would have gotten to 4.5. In fact, that's what government presented. So government has a plan to get to normal ways post-COVID. Now, if we decided that we are unable to accommodate some of the revenue measures, then unless we are very clear in our mind the expenditures we will cut, you will miss that fiscal deficit path. The consequences for the city as investors look on will be there.
It's 1.75 too much. I mean, there are many who have said that this is a new levy we are introducing, electronic transaction levy. I mean, we could have started from 0.5% or 0.6%, and we go straight to 1.75 from where you sit as the chairman of the Finance Committee in Parliament. It's 1.75 too much.
If I look at just the budget, and I look at what the 1.75% of the volumes that have been indicated would bring, then I would say you even probably need more. But I'm also listening to its effect at the micro level, individuals and its effect on them, what it could potentially do to electronic exchange of value instead of cash handling. then you probably want to consider something lower. But overall, I think it is the Ministry of Finance that should look at the fiscal impact of doing one or the other. I have sat in the Ministry of Finance before, and I know for these revenue measures, you fix a rate, you look at the yield and how it contributes to the fiscal. And you try to make it as low as possible, because no government enjoys slapping taxes and paying the political price. No government wants it. So you do the analysis and you reach a certain rate and you say, at this rate, this is how much revenue we will get. It would support the fiscal and support the deficit targets. So if government were to consider that it wanted to even reduce the 1.75, or it wanted to reconsider some of the revenue measures, myself, sitting on the finance committee, will be asking government what is given. Something must give around figure.
Right. Are we going to be seeing Ken Ofori-Atta present a reviewed budget, 2022 budget, looking at the brouhaha around, some of the policies that he intends to introduce? Should we expect it? We've heard people say that some of the parts that says inward remittances is likely that is going to be exempted from the 1.75. Should we expect anything like that?
The policy intention was indicated in the budget statement. Now, what would actually give effect to that policy is the legislation. Once the legislation comes to Parliament, we would know exactly what government is taxing, what is included, what is not included, which is also the reason I think rejecting the policy itself was premature, because the details are yet to be placed before us. Of course, the finance minister did indicate some details in the budget, but having listened to the feedback from the public, maybe he may want to sit down and decide that, look, I want to cut this expenditure and reduce the rate a little bit, or whatever government intends to do would come in the bill that will lay before Parliament and refer to the Finance Committee. So if you were to ask me, I would say the Finance Minister right now does not have to do anything, because as far as he's concerned, he's laid the budget in Parliament. If you take the view that 137 members of a 275 member Parliament can make a decision that requires half, if you take that view, then of course you probably say that he would have to represent a budget. But if you believe, as I do, as I consider the constitutional provision, that the budget is still before us as a Parliament, then the Finance Minister doesn't have to do anything. And I don't think the Finance Minister has to do anything. I think Parliament itself must look at the budget and make a decision whether it wants to accept it as a working document or whether it wants to reject it. As I speak to you, I do not think the budget has been properly rejected. And tomorrow we will be in the chamber. We would see what exactly happened. But I'm very clear in my mind that the decision that the Speaker presided over was completely unconstitutional.
Well, would that be happening tomorrow? Are we likely, is Parliament likely to take a look at all that has happened on Friday and see whether we can pay attention? Is it even on schedule for tomorrow?
Yes, tomorrow we're sitting. I don't know what the business committee would have decided, but definitely an important matter like that, even if it wasn't programmed, if it's not on the order paper, has to be introduced into the discussion, because I am hearing people express the concern that the budget has been rejected and the minority insisting that that decision has to be respected and all that. I think it will be necessary for Parliament to tidy all that up. And I think tomorrow, whatever it is, it will have to be on the business for the House. And hopefully by the close of the day, we should be able to come to some closure on the subject of what the House wants to do with the budget that was presented. But I have to make the point I made at the beginning, that if for some reasons maybe I can't foresee now, it is not possible to approve the budget that is now before us. And it is not possible to have expenditure in advance of appropriation approved by the House. Then the option we have as a country, in order that we can continue paying the teachers, the nurses, and meeting our international obligations and doing all the critical things, security, that the president has responsibility to do, he will have to declare a state of emergency. And if that were to happen, I think it would be in order.
Okay. Honorable Kukwati, we are grateful that you made time to speak with us this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you too for coming.